You remember the days back when you could make a stupid spelling mistake and it would automatically make whatever you had just written that much cooler? Yeah, I don't remember that time either, but in video games it is apparently a thing. One of the most famous examples, of course, is Mortal Kombat, spelled with a K instead of a C because we all know that K is the superior letter. Sorry, Contra. But over a decade before that, it had been happening in video games back on the Atari 2600. One of the most prominent examples of this was in the game Berzerk. Berzerk, made by Stern Arcades, had started out as an arcade game in 1980, and was actually pretty innovative for its time. It was well known that it used digitized speech in a very interesting manner, having the robotic enemies talk to you and even taunt you at certain points in the game. But we're not here to talk about the arcade version, we are here to talk about its home console edition on the Atari 2600. And before anybody says anything, no, it's not as good as the arcade version, but then again, when you take a game from the arcade to the 2600, it is of course going to be a little bit pared down. Not in a horrible way. Most ports from the arcades did actually retain a lot of their great gameplay, they just lost a lot of their bells and whistles that made them such a tour de force in the arcades. So of course, you can forget about the digitized speech in this game. But how does the game itself hold up now that it's on a home console? Surprisingly well, believe it or not. The game itself is incredibly simplistic, and the story is basically there just to give you a reason for what you're doing. You play an unnamed humanoid running through a seemingly endless labyrinth, running from a giant army of killer robots and the mysterious evil Otto, who will most certainly murder you as soon as he finds you. And that's about all you get for story, folks. But really, that's all you need. So, talking about gameplay, how do you go about avoiding the robots? Well, of course, you shoot them, and you do that with your laser gun. But they will also try to shoot you with their laser guns, so you want to avoid that. Of course, the shots are incredibly slow from both yours and their shots, so it's not exactly difficult to do so. The shots do get much faster as the game progresses, but early on it's almost laughably easy to avoid getting hit. Touching a robot will also destroy you, as will touching any of the walls in the labyrinth, so you have to be relatively precise, especially when you're running around corners and the like. You also have multiple exits that you can go through in each stage, so you don't necessarily have to worry about which way you're going. The levels are randomly generated, even if they do seem a little bit small. In the arcade, the mazes were actually a bit bigger, but in this game, of course, once again, pared down for the 2600 version. Definitely doesn't interfere with the fun factor, however. So, you fight your way through each room, going through each level, but what happens if you take too long? Well, you don't necessarily have to kill the robots to progress. You can still go through any opening, so long as you can make it there before you get killed. You can actually clear most of the levels without firing a single shot, but the enemies will actively taunt you, calling you a chicken in between levels if you do this. But it is actually to your advantage to do this sometimes because if you take too long, evil Otto appears, and unlike the other enemies in the stage, he is very, very fast, and the more levels you clear, the faster he gets, and the more difficult he is to avoid. If he touches you, you guessed it, you lose a life. One of the major drawbacks, of course, is the fact that it's not very challenging, at least on early levels, and even in the higher difficulties, it takes a while for the game to really pick up some steam. It lulls you into a false sense of security, and really tries your patience when you finally get up to levels that are actually difficult. But one of the main problems with this is the fact that the AI does not help very much, or rather the lack of AI. Enemies will always tromp straight towards you no matter how far you are on the screen. So once you come into their line of vision, they will make a beeline for you in the straightest line possible. And since they can be killed by their own shots, and by running into the walls or each other themselves, well, most levels can be cleared of enemies without firing a single laser, and regardless of whether or not you're the one to kill the enemy, you still get the points, which really was one of the only reasons to keep playing an Atari game was for a high score. Evil Otto, however, can kill the enemies, but he cannot be killed. The game is also endless, so there really is no point in trying to look for an end screen. The game only ends once you run out of lives or turn off the system, as was the case with many Atari 2600 games. The only other thing that really bothers me about this game is its control scheme, and that's primarily because the game hasn't really aged well, or rather, the controller hasn't aged well. If you're the type of guy who's grown up in an age with D-pads or analog controllers, the extreme stiffness of the Atari 2600 joystick takes a lot of patience to get used to. The fact that you can only move it in 8 specific directions does not help, and you can't swivel it from one direction to the next. It always has to return to the center before you can press it in another direction. This makes it difficult to move your character in any way that's very fluent, so sometimes you will find yourself accidentally running into a wall or walking into the path of an enemy without meaning to just because you couldn't turn in time. Again, that's not a problem with the game, it's a problem with the age of the control scheme based on the era it was birthed in. The graphics, what little there are also okay. The enemies look like enemies, the walls look like walls, Evil Otto looks like something, and you're very easily identifiable. True, there's not really much in the way of graphics as we know them today, but again, 2600 game, and for what they had to work with, it turned out very well. So this was a short review this week, but really it's a 2600 game, so there's not a whole lot of ground to cover, but there is plenty of fun to be had with this one, and if you can track down a copy, Berzerk is dirt cheap. In fact, it's one of the many games that are included on the Atari Flashback game consoles that you can find for a pittance online by now. So go and give it a try, and I guarantee that once you get past the easy first stages, you will really get addicted to what was probably some of the best shooter gameplay that they had back then. Aside from Space Invaders and Space Hawk and Space Wars, there were a lot of space games back then.